Hello. It's great to see you all. It's great especially to see you if you're here for the first time. Not that we're biased, but we do love to see new people, and I hope you're enjoying being here. It's great to meet you, and I hope you stick around to have a chat with us and get to know us better at the end. I'm going to be speaking this morning as the last time for my laptop, the last part of our series that we've been going through for the last couple of months, which is called Take Up Your Cross and Follow Me. And essentially what we've been doing is exploring what it looks like to truly follow Jesus today. What does it look like to actually follow Jesus, to be a Christian? What does life actually look like? And we love teaching from the Bible here at Freedom Church. And we love particularly tackling difficult subjects, because when we do that, when we dig into what the Bible has to say, even about the most difficult things, the things that really challenge us, that is where we allow God to search us, to shape us, to mold us, to grow us, and we learn more about what it is to follow him. And you know what? This series has actually been quite a tough journey, because we've gone through some pretty deep and difficult subjects. We've looked at things like self-denial and forgiveness and death and humility and obedience and sacrifice. There's been some meaty stuff to go through, some pretty big hitting things. And I think we've probably learned that being a Christian isn't all skipping through the daisies. Jesus really wasn't kidding when he said to follow me is to take up your cross. The Christian life is often a road marked with suffering and pain and difficulty, and nevertheless, it is a blessed and abundant life. And we live in this tension where life is difficult, and yet Jesus says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. And we're called to be like Jesus, and that's difficult, but we are lavished with his abundant grace and love when we get it wrong. And as we've gone through this series, it's been brilliant to hear different bits of feedback from people who've responded and said, you know what? God's doing something in me here. God's put his finger on something in my life that I know needs to change. And as I say, that's what happens when we treat the word of God with respect, when we allow it to challenge us. People's lives change for the better. And I want to encourage us, even as we finish the series, to keep going with that. Keep digging into Scripture. Keep digging into what God is saying. Keep digging into what it is like to follow Jesus and allow him to change it. Because as we do that, as we allow ourselves to follow Jesus more closely, that is how we're going to impact the city, as Nick's just been talking about. The more we follow Jesus, the more we mold ourselves after him, the more we will impact. Now, today might feel like a bit of a relief as we come to the end of the series, because after all the challenging and soul-searching stuff we've been looking at, we've looked at forgiveness and sacrifice and obedience and death. Today, we're looking at love. We all like love, don't we? Actually, as a society, we're obsessed with love. We build our lives around the things that we love. Our families, our friends, our hobbies, our sports teams. Most often, of course, those of us who are fortunate to meet the love of our lives, as people call it, our romantic partners. We build our lives around the things and the people we love. And the media bombards us with love stories. And in the Western world especially, love is everywhere. Even in the most macho of action films, you'll find a love story in there somewhere. It's impossible to have a Hollywood film without a love story involved somehow. And yet there's some interesting trends in our modern world, especially here in the West. I know not everyone here is from the West, but hopefully you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. In America, 75% of people have had 3 long-term relationships. That tells you something. In America and the UK, more people now cohabit, live together without being married than actually get married. And the main reason that people put down to not getting married is money. Money. That's what stops them from tying the knot. Around half of marriages, again here in the Western world, end in divorce or separation, as opposed to ending when one of the partner dies, as is promised in the marriage service. The top 3 reasons for marriages ending are unfaithfulness, incompatibility, so couples just deciding, do you know what, we don't really get on anymore. We're not really right for each other. And again, the third reason, money. And the average marriage length in the USA is 7 years. It turns out the 7-year itch really may be a thing. Now, Matt preached some time ago a sermon that I've always remembered. A rare thing to remember one of Matt's sermons, but just joking. Love you, Matt. I love you, Matt. He preached. He preached about the society we live in being what he called a disposable contract society. Do you remember that? He preached about how we're very happy just to move on with our lives. If you don't like it, rip it up and get another one. Move on. But I would say we're possibly even going further now. We're not even willing to enter a disposable contract. A lot of people aren't even willing to put their name to something because, do you know what? It's not worth the risk. It's not worth the commitment. It's only going to finish anyway. I won't even bother signing that contract. I won't even bother getting married to this person who I love because it'll only lead to more heartache as we go. Our view of love is so jaded and battered that we'd rather not go through the stress of committing to someone because the likelihood is it just won't last and it'll be harder to unpick if we've signed something. That's our view of love in society a lot of the time. And yet Jesus says this, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. That's in John 13:34. And that's nice and easy, isn't it? Love one another. We can do that, right? Maybe we think, that seems possible, but actually when Jesus talks about loving one another, he's not talking about love in a sort of squishy, romantic, soft way like this. The loving one another that Jesus talks about is much more like this. This is what it looks like to love one another as Jesus loves us. Picking up our crosses and following Jesus is no small thing, and it stands in stark contrast to what we've just talked about is the world's view of love. And so I want to look at love this morning through the lens of Jesus dying on the cross. That's going to be our focus this morning. What does the cross itself, the act of Jesus coming to earth and dying for our sins on the cross, what does that teach us about loving like him? See, Jesus is the most loving person who has ever lived. No one could truly match him in terms of the purity, the consistency, the warmth, and the selflessness of his love. And we see it all the way through his life. It's consistent. But it's on the cross. It's on the cross that we see it displayed in one place for all to see, encapsulated in this moment, the most significant moment in history. Jesus calls us to love as he loved us, and on the cross we see just how he did it. And the first thing we see is this. The cross invites us to love those people who are even the hardest to love. Becky read the passage this morning, which is in my preach, which is great because I hadn't told her what I was speaking on. But Jesus demonstrates on the cross that loving like him means loving our enemies. In John 16, Jesus says, greater love has no man than to lay down his life for his friends. If you've got a friend who's very dear to you, who you would lay down your life for, that's a massive thing. It's a hugely sacrificial thing. But Jesus didn't just die for his friends. He died for his enemies. And the passage Becky read, Romans 5, you see just at the right time. When we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Jesus hung there on a cross in full sight of people who wanted him to be there, who had campaigned for his death, who gathered to watch his slow, agonizing demise with perverse enjoyment. And not only was he dying because of them, he was dying for them. Despite everything, he wanted them to know his Father's love and to be transformed by his forgiveness. And so as he stood on that cross, nailed, bleeding, dying, and he was watching the Roman soldiers dividing his last possessions between them, as he was being mocked and scorned and shamed by those who were there, Jesus cries out, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. At the very height of his suffering, in the most pain you could imagine, Jesus cried out for forgiveness for those who least deserved it. And we can tut and shake our heads at those people. We can think, oh, aren't they awful? Weren't those Romans terrible for doing what they did? Weren't those Jews who campaigned for him to die awful, standing at the cross and mocking him as he died? But the fact is, when the Bible talks about Jesus dying for the ungodly, it's talking about us. It's talking about us. We are the enemies that Jesus died for. We are the people that, but for the sacrifice Jesus made on the cross, we will be in complete opposition to God. And we are the ones who, despite knowing exactly what Jesus has done for us and what it cost him, we still regularly go on sinning and letting him down. There's a brilliant film called 1917, and this may be the most up-to-date film reference we've ever had in a preach at Freedom Church. Normally we're stuck somewhere back in the early 2000s or late 90s. This film is only, I think it's less than 5 years old. I'm going to claim it as the most up-to-date. 3 years old, Andy, thank you. The film's called 1917. It's an amazing film which really gives you an idea of the horror of the First World War. And there's an amazing scene which has always stuck in my mind, where you've got two British soldiers walking through a village in France, and they're exploring this very eerie, deserted farm. And as they're exploring, they hear a noise in the sky, and they see two British fighter planes chasing a German fighter plane. And they're just hoping that they're going to shoot this plane down, and they do. The German fighter plane gets shot down, but their joy suddenly turns to panic because the plane starts plummeting out of the sky straight towards them. And you get this amazing scene where they're running towards the camera and the plane's bearing down behind them, and they dive out of the way and the plane crashes into the barn on the farm, just missing them. But what happens next is incredible, because the plane is in the barn, it's starting to burst into flames, and they notice that the pilot of the plane, this German soldier, is still alive and he's crying out for help. And they rush to his aid, this enemy soldier, and they pull him out of the burning cockpit of the plane and pull him to safety. And one of them says, we need to get this guy some water, we need to help him. It's an incredible act of grace, loving one's enemy. And so one of the soldiers goes to the water pump at the other side of the farm to fill his helmet with water to help this soldier, and suddenly he hears a horrible noise of screaming, and he turns round and sees that this German soldier who's just been rescued has stabbed his colleague in the stomach. The very guy who's been rescued and shown incredible grace repays it with an act of pure evil. And sadly, the British soldier passes away. It's a really powerful and intense movie scene. And it makes your blood boil at the injustice of it. Because this incredible act of grace and kindness is met by violent rejection. And yet, you know what? That's not a million miles away from what Jesus goes through. God sends his Son, who selflessly acts to save the very people who've rejected him and his Father. And all too often, that saving act of grace is met with rejection. Some simply never accept Christ's love. But others, like you and me sitting here today, accept it and then throw it back in his face anyway by sinning. And yet, Jesus died on the cross for his enemies. He knew what was going to happen. He knew we'd throw it back in his face. He knew we'd get it wrong. The cost is huge. But he did it. And he asks us to do the same. He asks us to love like him, to love our enemies. And it's not easy. The cost is large and we will get it thrown back in our face. But it's the gospel and it's what he wants us to do. There's a brilliant book by a guy called Dane Ortland called Gentle and Lowly. If you've not read it, I heartily recommend it to you. But he says this: God didn't meet us halfway. He refused to hold back, cautious and assessing our worth. That's not his heart. He and his Son took the initiative. On terms of grace and grace alone, in defiance of what we deserved, when we, despite our smiles and civility, were running from God as fast as we could, building our own kingdoms and loving our own glory, lapping up the fraudulent pleasures of the world, repulsed by the beauty of God and shutting up our ears as his calls to come home. It was then, in the hollowed out horror of that revolting existence, that the Prince of Heaven bade his adoring angels farewell. It was then that he put himself into the murderous hands of these very rebels in a divine strategy, planned from eternity past to rinse muddy sinners clean and hug them into his heart, despite their squirmy attempt to get free and scrub themselves clean. Christ went down into death, voluntary endurance of unutterable anguish, while we applauded. We couldn't have cared less. We were weak. We were sinners. We were his enemies. But he did it for us, and he calls us to do the same. It's a big challenge. It's a big challenge. The second thing the cross teaches us is that we're invited to love even though it's very painful. It's related to the first point. But Jesus really did experience the most intense and barbaric and long pain imaginable. Mental and physical torture. And the thing that made him do that, quite simply, was love. Love for his Father. Love for the people he was dying to save. Love for his enemies. Jesus considered that offering this salvation and going through this pain was worth suffering for. It was worth the sacrifice. And that is in stark contrast, isn't it, to the statistics we looked at earlier. Jesus is so loving that he died for us. He went through all of that pain. And yet seemingly, as a society, we're not willing to put a ring on someone's finger because the financial package might not be attractive enough. Do you know what? Truly loving someone involves opening ourselves up and acknowledging that we might get hurt. Or we will get hurt. Hopefully none of us will go through the agony of crucifixion for loving someone. But in love there will be pain. And there will be hurt and there will be disappointment. Committing to loving people is committing to getting hurt. And yet that is what we're called to do. And he did it for us. And he wants us to do it for others. And the other thing that the cross teaches us is that it invites us to love through action and not just words. See, Jesus was an incredible teacher. If he'd never done a miracle in his life, if he'd never died on the cross, his words would still have been influential, and they're still influencing us 2,000 years on. Many of the things that Jesus said have become turns of phrase that we just use routinely, even those of us who aren't Christians. But Jesus didn't just talk a good game. He didn't just say the right things. He put love into action. And he demonstrates that most clearly on the cross. He could have avoided death if he wanted to. He could have jumped down off the cross and saved himself and changed the situation. And if he'd done that, he would have demonstrated his power. But by not doing that and taking action and dying, he demonstrated love in action. And to love like Jesus means that our actions need to be affected. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not our actions that save us. We believe in a gospel of grace by faith alone. We are only saved by loving Jesus and accepting his sacrifice for us. But once we've done that, Jesus asks and expects of us that our actions change. And we do something with our lives that shows his love. The proof of the pudding's in the eating. If we truly love Jesus, then our actions will become more like his. That's the third thing the cross teaches us. So, how do we work this out? Jesus gives this ultimate demonstration of love. I'm just touching on just the bare minimum here. The cross teaches us about love. But how do we actually do it? What does it look like to love like Jesus? To pick up our cross and follow him in that way? Well, within the church body, first of all, we see a few things. The second half of that verse that I read earlier, where Jesus said, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you, you ought to love one another." The second part of that verse, verse 35 in John 13, is this: "By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." Cross-shaped love starts with how we, as Christians, behave with one another. The world looks at how Christians interact, and it makes their minds up pretty quickly about whether the Jesus that we preach about and talk about is actually worth their time and attention. And so that means some pretty profound things for us as a church family. Do you know what? At Freedom Church Liverpool, there'll be some people that you don't agree with. And God calls us to love each other. We don't need complete unity of doctrine. We don't need to agree with each other on absolutely everything. But if we get divided by what we do disagree on, that's a big problem, and the world takes notice. People disagree in Freedom Church. People disagree, I'm sure, in Frontline and every other church in the city as well. I can well remember times where I've had vastly different opinions about different things. I remember a time where in the space of 2 weeks, someone told me that they didn't think women should be allowed to teach in church, and I had someone else say, I think women should be allowed to be elders in the church. Completely opposite ends of the spectrum in the same church. And that's okay. We can get around it. We unite around the cross. I've had people tell us, we really want a drum kit. We really want a drum kit in church. And I've had other people say, I've had other people tell me, if we get a drum kit, I'm leaving. Genuinely. I've had people say, we really need to start church on time. If we don't start church on time, it's just silly. And I've had other people say, no, just chill out. We like being able to wander in a bit later. It's a nice, informal, relaxing thing. We've had people who think the kids should go out after 1 song, 2 songs, 3 songs, 4 songs. Stay the whole time, don't go out at all, or go out for the whole thing. We have different opinions, and it's all right. We overcome these things because our priority is uniting around the cross. That is essential. And if we can agree on the centrality of the gospel, then nothing else really matters. We are brothers and sisters, and we will always be brothers and sisters. I don't know about you, but I've got brothers and sisters who are related to me by blood, and trust me, we do not agree on anything. My eldest sister is a Liverpool fan. My youngest sister is a Man United fan who loves Take That. And that is about the most up-to-date musical reference you'll get in Freedom Church. My big brother and I, when we used to share a room when we were younger, fought so much that my parents rearranged the furniture to put the wardrobes right down the middle of the room so that we couldn't interact with each other. We still threw toys over the top at each other and threw missiles at each other. Do you know what? We don't get on all that well all the time, but we are bonded by our blood, and we love each other, and there's nothing I wouldn't do for my brothers and sisters apart from support Liverpool. And do you know what, guys? We too, the church, we are bonded by the blood of Christ. We're bonded by what unites us. And that is more important than any other link. And so when people look from outside and they see a church bickering and falling out, it does damage. But when they see us loving one another despite our differences, it speaks something mighty about the gospel. Loving like Jesus means that we love people who hurt us. There is no room for bitterness and unforgiveness in God's church. And we covered this in more detail earlier in the series. Chris did a fantastic talk on unforgiveness. If you haven't seen it, go back and watch it. It's fantastic. If you want to see a church family destroyed from the inside out, then hold on to your hurts. Hold on to your grudges and don't forgive. And you'll see it fall apart. If you're here for the first time today, I can 100% guarantee that if you come back and you stay long enough, someone's going to upset you. It might have already happened. Okay? It might have already happened. And that's the problem with church, because it's full of people. But it's also the joy of church. It's full of people. And as people, we do dumb stuff and we hurt one another. And we can't eradicate that unless we ban people. And we're not going to do that. Okay? The key is how we respond. Do we hold on to our hurts and we bear grudges, or do we seek at all times forgiveness, restoration, seeing people through God's eyes, and enacting the same kind of grace and love that Jesus enacted for us on the cross in front of the very people who would put him there? Loving like Jesus involves loving people who hurt us. And loving like Jesus in the church involves loving people who don't look like us and think like us. In fact, it means loving them especially much. It's been a huge part of Freedom Church's heart all along that we be a church that loves the nations And praise God, after many years of prayer, we're starting to see more and more different nations coming and being in the building and worshiping with us. And that absolutely warms our hearts. It's becoming part of our reality. And can I encourage you that this is a glimpse of heaven? For all tongues and tribes and nations to be gathered around, united and praising God together. And so let's be people who go out of our way to love and fellowship with those from outside our own little cultural bubbles. To not just stick to our own, but to be people who seek to welcome and love and spend time with those who maybe don't look like us, or maybe came from a different background from us, or maybe haven't had the same life experience as us, whatever that looks like. Jesus found himself on the cross, sandwiched between two robbers, being abused by Roman soldiers. People who this Jewish carpenter from Nazareth didn't really have much to do with. And yet he just poured out his love on them. He just poured out his love on them. They couldn't have been more different from him. They couldn't have had more different attitudes from him. He just loved them. I want to encourage you, press into relationships with people who are different. Learn each other's cultures. Open your homes and your hearts to one another. Share new experiences. And rejoice that we are bound together by Christ's love poured out on the cross. This Jewish Messiah who opened up the way for all nations to be saved. When we do that, church, we show the world a picture of what is to come. Let's do it. That's what it looks like in the church. Loving like Jesus in the church. What about outside of the church? How does loving like Jesus affect our behavior towards the world? The cross is the expression, the ultimate expression of God's love for the world. And we're to love the world in light of that act of sacrifice. And that means, first of all, love him more than we judge. I think, to be honest, the church is increasingly seen as a somewhat judgmental, hypocritical and unloving organisation by a lot of people in the world. And we need to recover to a point where the world sees us first and foremost as a beacon of love and hope, where people can belong even before they believe. I was touched by a story by one of my favourite theologians and pastors, a guy called Preston Sprinkle. Ridiculous name. Debbie couldn't remember his name the other day and called him Thingy Sprinkly Thing. It's not his name, it's Preston Sprinkle. He told a story. Preston Sprinkle's got an amazing ministry, particularly writing about and reaching out to the LGBTQ community. And he tells a story of a young teenage woman in America who had come to realise that she was same-sex attracted. And she sat in her church one day as her pastor was preaching. And the pastor basically preached, if you are gay, if you're same-sex attracted, you are going to burn in hell. That's what he said. Word for word, you're going to hell. And not unsurprisingly, she left the church. She left the church feeling condemned, humiliated, ashamed, and she entered into a homosexual relationship with another woman and got married. Sadly, shortly after this, her new wife got cancer and died. And this poor woman was left utterly broken, not knowing where to turn, and just having a horrendous time. Amazingly, somehow, despite the way she'd been treated in the past, despite feeling so rejected, she did turn to God in this moment. And she went along to a different church and just basically said, I need help, I'm broken, I don't know what to do, can you help me? And the pastor who met with her, instead of saying, I'm sorry, but you're gay, you're not coming, you're going to rot in hell, he said, you know what? Before anything else at the moment, you are a widow. You are broken. You're grieving. Let us just love you. We're going to look after you. Forget about all the rest of it for now. Let's just help you. Just extended a heart of welcome and warmth to her. And gently, slowly, surely, she opened up to faith and she became a Christian again. And at that point, when she'd given her life to the Lord, a healthy conversation was able to take place about what it looks like to walk with same-sex attraction and her faith in Jesus. I think that's the way it's got to be. It's the way it's got to be. if we meet the world with judgment and criticism and say, you can't come here unless you stop this or stop that or do this and do that, people ain't going to come. People ain't going to come and join this family if we just stand in judgment rather than love. But if we welcome people to come as they are and to meet a God who transforms lives and who has a heart for them and a love for them, no matter what the stuff they're coming with, then we can see amazing things happen. I can't tell you how important this is. I believe millions of potential followers of Jesus have been turned away from church because they've been told they're too messed up and too sinful to be welcome here. And I don't see that in the way Jesus loved. Jesus didn't say, I'll get on this cross once you've sorted yourself out. He just didn't. He got up there knowing the mess we were in, knowing the stuff we had done wrong and would do wrong, and died for us anyway. And that's what loving like Jesus looks like. Can we be a church who welcomes first, who loves first, and then helps people along the way later? And finally, how this looks as we engage with the world is that we love even though it costs us. We had our social action Sunday last week where we reflected on what God's been doing with the different projects that we've been running and the things that are coming up. And it was wonderful to see what God has done. But being absolutely honest, if you look at our projects, it hasn't resulted in loads of extra bums on seats in church. There's not a long list of Baby Basics clients who receive the basket and then become members of our church. There's no debt advice clients who have turned around and realised that the biggest debt they owe is to God and have come and asked God to clear that debt for them and become a Christian, join us at Freedom Church. We're just beginning to see some salvation fruit in Someone Cares, in the old day hospital ministry that we're doing. But they're not coming to our church, they're going elsewhere. And do you know what? That is all absolutely fine. We are not here to make our name great. We are not here to grow our own little empire. We're not here to put bums on seats. We are simply here to make God's name known to a hurting world, to express his love in whatever way we can. And that will cost us. It will cost us our time. It will cost us our money. It will cost us our resources. It will cost us our energy. But it is communicating something of the love of God. Sometimes other people will reap the harvest, and that's okay. But we are to be a church that loves despite the cost. We're to be a church that pushes beyond sort of inactivity. I don't care if we never see an earthly reward for what we do, because we know our reward in heaven is going to be rich beyond words. And so we keep going. We keep loving. We keep working with other churches in the city to reach this city with the love of God, whatever the cost. Whatever the cost. Because the city needs to see his love displayed. It's not about our reward. It's not about what we're going to gain here. It's just about ploughing the fields and sowing the seeds. It's a big challenge, isn't it? It's a big challenge. To love people even though it costs us. To love people who hurt us. To love people even though we're not going to get thanked for it sometimes. To love people even though they're our enemies. To forgive people who hurt us. And yeah, that's what Jesus asks us to do. But he asks us to do it having done it all for us in the first place. He sets the pattern. He sets the template. He asks us to do it. And he absolutely showers us in our grace, knowing that we'll often get it wrong. And we will get it wrong. We will mess it up. We will make mistakes. There'll be times when we absolutely fail at this. And his sacrifice still stands and still covers us for all of that. But he wants us to try. He wants us to put it first. He wants us to do it. And so as a church this morning, as individuals this morning, let's just ask ourselves some questions. Is there an enemy in your life? An opponent? Who God might just be calling you to show his unmerited grace and favour to in a new way. Someone you've been avoiding, someone you've been angry at, someone you look at and think, I don't want to help that person. Maybe God's just giving you a nudge this morning to say, I want you to extend that grace. Is there anyone you need to forgive this morning? Is there a grudge or a hurt that you're holding on to that's eating away at you? And you realize, you know what? This is doing me damage. I need to forgive that person. Do it this morning. Is there anywhere where you might be counting the cost of love and withholding it because it just feels like too much of a price to pay? Might God be saying to you this morning, you know what? There is a cost, but I want you to pay it anyway, like I paid it for you. Is there anywhere in our lives where we are tending more towards judgment than love? Is there anywhere where we might be expressing our opinion and telling everyone how they're doing it wrong when actually what they really need to hear is there's a God who loves you and is gracious towards you? Come and get to know him, then we can sort the rest out. And is God asking you this morning to put your love for him into action? Is there something that you could do to show your love as Jesus loved it in more action? Let's just spend some time worshiping, responding to God. I'm going to hand over to Matt.